Curioso, and welcome back to the Welsh History Podcast, episode 244 Settlement, Colony, or Pyramid Scheme. When I started researching this episode, I have to admit I was very uninformed on exactly what the story is in regards to this particular important item. And because of that, I think it goes back to learning more and more. I was like, okay, how do I do this and give it the proper examination and the proper discussion without roiling into a lot of controversy and a controversial topic? So I'm going to do my best to give order to both sides, allow the discussion to be had, knowing that a lot of people will have very different feelings necessarily. And I've seen it online. There's a lot of arguing about this. Now, what are we talking about? And it can be one of those things where when we look into history, we see things in various perspectives. It can be about finding hope or building belief or country or a cultural idea, for example, or it can also be about the darker parts of our society and how it can at times be overcome, or in other times create conflicting views and problematic explanations for ourselves. Since the 1960s, colonialism and colonization has taken on a very different meaning from the one that came before it. And within or without society, these views can be difficult to deal with, difficult to explain, difficult to come back from either highly defensive or highly, I don't want to say offensive, but you know what I mean? Like, it's difficult for people to sit there and take one side or the other and not end up into a conflict with somebody else as this social media age that we have becomes. And labels and labeling have not made things better. They're making it quite a bit more difficult to have a conversation, which is based on fact, or at least based on agreed understanding, and not have it devolve into something that I personally don't want to do. So I am going to bring up my own personal point of view on this subject simply because I think the term colonizer is too simplistic of a term. I think it falls into a very black and white structure of the world, in a world that is not black and white, and that it's not easy to define these things. And because of that, we end up with a lot of people who are very insistent on one side and very insistent on the other. And I fall in the category of I don't like the term. I think it's, like I said, I think it's too simplistic. It's like calling somebody, a label, and I hesitate to use these terms, but keep in mind how I'm describing them. So if you describe someone who you don't agree with as a Nazi or as a communist, to use both sides of the terminology, if everyone is one of those, then nobody is, because the label then loses all meaning. And I think it's important and critical to keep that in mind when we talk about terminologies. That doesn't mean that it takes away from problematic situations. It simply means that we're giving some sort of definition around it, and defining things clearly so that we're not making a very muddled discussion. Because once you start to say, well, let's just say, if I say the color black or the color green or the color blue is described in a certain way that becomes very vague, then does that lead us into a situation where we don't know what the color blue is anymore, because we don't know if it's slightly green, is it slightly orange, is it somewhere in between? And thus we come up with different terms for different colors to try and define that, and in some cases come up with different names completely. All of these things being the case, this is where I want to go with this. So I'm giving a lot of definition to something that may be a little conflicting and confusing, but I just wanted to kind of start from the beginning, because I know this is, as I said, just from reading and running into comment sections, which go back and forth a lot on Patagonia, and this is what we're talking about today, I realized very quickly that there are specific takes that are very controversial and very much built around the idea that, you know, pro or con both sides about the settlement of Patagonia, some of which I found to be a bit on the ridiculous side, some of which on both sides get a little bit caught up in too much of, you know, thou art not great sort of ideaing. And I get a little uncomfortable with that. And I get very annoyed with some of it because it seems so blind to a lot of the discussion points. So instead of continuing to vaguely prattle on, how about we continue a little bit? Now, if you were to look at this from my own personal point of view, it's very difficult to hold people to account for things. And especially when you end up on both sides of the discussion, as I do myself. My family history is, my immediate ancestry is both English and Welsh. And so who am I mad at? you know, am I mad at Edward the First or Harold Godwinson for killing various leaders in Wales? Am I mad at William the Conqueror, who set in motion the eventual conquest of Wales? Am I mad at the Welsh princes and kings who basically spent so much time fighting that they basically led themselves into being conquered? Or am I just realizing that there's a lot of diversity of opinion and a lot of diversity of situations and circumstances, and it's not as easy as that? That's kind of where I'm at with this. Like when we start to talk about colonizing and then it becomes about England colonizing Wales, well, that becomes very confusing for me because I happen to be on both sides of the argument, by ancestry at least. Lean into my Welsh heritage, I admit, but at the same time, I do have English heritage. I have Canadian heritage. I have sort of kind of American heritage, if you want to call it that, just simply because my family moved up at the end of the Revolutionary War. There's a lot of that going on, and so it's difficult for me to get into these discussions. And, old white guy leads to a whole nother conversation. But as I said, as we get into this, this is what we want to discuss. We want to keep in mind that there is flashpoints of this discussion, and it is not all clear and not all bad. So there's not all good, but there's not all bad. There are shades of gray in this conversation that we all have to acknowledge exist. It's the complicated problem that we all have in the circumstances of effectively the conquering and settling of Americas, and how that influenced and affected the people that were living there at the time, and the consequence of that. So, with all of that given in, shall we talk about the actual subject? So, we're not here to celebrate particularly anything, but I think we need to talk about this because it is an important situation. The arrival of Welsh people to Patagonia is, at least from the settler point of view, one of avoiding and getting away from the persecution perceived, or at the very least, the erasure of culture that they were seeing, especially around the language, which drove them to leave in the first place. And of course, the conflict here was there some of this being reflected back at them later, which we'll discuss. And I want to say that we're going to categorize everything a little tightly so that we're not getting into cross conversations, so to speak. So this is the discussion of the settlement of Patagonia, the arrival of the mimosa, and the development of the first Welsh, and I use the term loosely, colony. They call it a colony, so I guess I should probably label it as such as well. In the mid-19th century, of course, Wales was changing fast, and the Industrial Revolution was reshaping both the landscape and its people. And because of it, the Welsh culture, as we've talked about quite extensively in the last year or so, has been under threat from the advent of the arrival and of the general usage of English, and the arrival of a lot of English people into these very busy and economically flourishing areas, especially in the southeast and the northeast. Many of the Welsh speakers began to fear that their language and traditions would be swallowed whole, which, as we can obviously point to, this was definitely a concern. In this context, a group began to imagine what would appear to be a radical idea, a Welsh-speaking colony free from the pressures of Anglicanization, a place where the chapel language and culture could thrive because it wasn't in the United Kingdom, or at least right up against English language people. Of course, this was not the first time that people from the United Kingdom had tried this. In fact, importing Brits was kind of a thing they did at this time. But this would be the first for Wales, a purely Welsh colony full of Welsh speakers. Unless we're going to label Brittany as the first one of those, which you might be able to do if you wanted to go back far enough. One of the central figures of this particular idea was Michael D. Jones, a nationalist and nonconformist minister who, in an 1861 meeting held at his home in Bala, he gathered a group which then discussed the possible founding of this new Welsh land. And originally, the idea was possibly to the USA. Another was Vancouver Island in Canada, which at the time was relatively not settled by Europeans, although, again, going back to our original discussion, was very much settled by a lot of indigenous peoples. But eventually, a alternative destination was discussed, which seemed to have everything the colonists might need: Patagonia, Argentina. Jones, the principal at Bala College and a staunch nationalist, had been corresponding with the Argentinian government about settling an area known as Bahia Blanca, where Welsh immigrants would be allowed to retain and preserve their language, culture, and traditions. Granting such a request suited the Argentinian government, as this would allow them to control large tracts of land which they had been in a dispute with Chile over. A Welsh Immigration Committee met in Liverpool and published a handbook called the Colony Handbook to publicize the Patagonian scheme. The handbook was widely distributed throughout Wales and also in America. Jones worked with Lewis Jones and Captain Love Jones Perry, two prominent figures who traveled to Patagonia in 1862 to scout the land. They returned with false hope, I would argue, as they offered glowing reports of a fertile plain and friendly authorities. And with this in hand and this idea in mind, the stage was now set. So they were given false hope of effectively they were moving to a Welsh-like area, which, as we'll find out, is very much not what the situation was. I don't know why the Welsh investigators actually determined that this was a good thing to tell the people. It just immediately smacks of they got there, they thought the grass was greener without actually really knowing that the grass was going to be greener. I really don't understand it. It's illogical to me, but maybe they were bamboozled by the authorities. I just don't know. It made no sense to me. The journey of the Mimosa, the ship they used, was considered to be a iconic passage. It wasn't just a sea voyage, it was a cultural pilgrimage, as they described it, and a desperate hope to plant the seed of a nation thousands of miles away. In May of 1865, 153 passengers containing entire families from Wales boarded the Mimosa at the Liverpool docks. Their goal was to reach the land they had never seen, based largely on second-hand reports and patriotic optimism. The ship itself was a converted tea clipper. It was 35 years old and built for cargo, not for comfort. Passengers had paid £12 per adult or £6 for child for the journey. A not small sum, I would argue. The Mimosa settlers included tailors, cobblers, carpenters, brickmakers, and miners, and comprised 56 married adults, 33 widowed or single men, 12 single women, usually sisters or servants of married immigrants, and 52 children. The majority, 92, were from the South Wales coalfield and English urban centres. Before leaving, a council was elected to govern the settlement. The council consisted of 12 members, and a president, a secretary, a treasurer, an auditor were also elected. On 25th of May, the captain of the Mimosa, a 25-year-old man named George Pepperell, announced the anchor was about to be lifted, and hundreds of people, including Michael D. Jones and his wife Anne, gathered on the dock to bid farewell to the passengers. The Welsh banner was raised, and the passengers sung an anthem composed especially for the occasion to the tune of God Save the Queen. However, after leaving the dock, the Mimosa remained on the River Mersey for 3 days until the wind was favorable for them to leave. Finally, at 4 o'clock in the afternoon on the 28th of May, the anchor was raised and the Mimosa began its voyage to Patagonia. Generally, the trip across the Atlantic was described as fairly calm and uneventful, but on reaching Brazil, storms buffeted the small ship. Conditions on board, as you can imagine, of a small clipper ship were not necessarily comfortable and were basic at best. The passengers were crammed below decks with little ventilation and few provisions. Water was strictly rationed, as it always is on a sea voyage in the sailing era, and food consisted mainly of salted meat, dry biscuits, and porridge. Seasickness was rampant. Many became ill, and 4 children died before reaching Patagonia. Now, keep in mind, throughout all this, there are no farmers. All of these people that are traveling don't have any experience with agriculture, which is a bit of an interesting discussion, and seemingly most come from urban environments. To maintain morale, they held chapel services on deck, hymns were sung, sermons preached, and remarkably, a school was set up on board to continue the children's education. Their identity as Welsh nonconformists was central to their voyage as the ship passed through the southern hemisphere. As it crossed the equator on the 28th of June, many of them watched members of the crew as they celebrated this important milestone. John Seth Jones wrote an account of this event in his diary. Quote, 2 sailors wore long fake beards made from bits of rope, and fireworks were thrown into the air. The sailors threw buckets of water over each other. End quote. This practice took place in the night, and water was poured over almost all of the immigrants, apart from the women and children. Quoting, I had some 3 bucketfuls over my head, as well as some water splashed here and there. I went down before they finished, and this all took place before 9 o'clock. I waited until the dawn before going to bed, and then I stayed in bed throughout the morning. After they had thrown the water, they sent rockets up into the air, and many were sent up. Then many of the more respectable members went to have drinks with the captain in the cabin. It is said that many of them were rather drunk, but none of them appear in this book. End quote. On the 26th of July, almost after 2 months at sea, a member of the crew announced that land was finally in sight. The ship arrived at New Bay that night, and the passengers climbed to the deck to catch their first glimpse of the land in the morning as the sun rose. They soon discovered that the bay where they had landed was rocky and desolate, nothing like the fertile valley described for Love Jones Perry or Lewis Jones in their earlier scouting missions. Settlers had arrived at Puerto Medrin, and they'd been told that it was much like the green and fertile lowlands of Wales. In reality, it was a barren and inhospitable wind-swept pampas with no water, very little food, and no forest to provide building material or for shelter. They quickly realized that they had been misled, and whether intentionally or not, the land was not ready for settlement. The promise of a Welsh utopia was met with the harsh reality of the Patagonian steppe. But they'd not come this far just to turn back. Some of the settlers' first homes, in fact, were dug out from the soft rock of the cliffs in that bay. However, it is important to understand the controversy around this settlement, one that has existed for a while in both Wales and in Argentina, as mentioned at the beginning of this particular podcast. While the story of the colony is often told as a tale of resilience and cultural preservation, and we'll bring this up later, so be aware, it's important to acknowledge that it's not without controversy, both at the time and in how we reflect upon it today. To begin with, the original idea of the settlement was seen by some in Wales as deeply unrealistic. Critics argued that it was naive to think that a remote colony could shield Welsh culture from the forces of global change. Others viewed it as escapist, a retreat from the political fight for Welsh rights at home, something that is still said today, which I still find insulting, is this concept that somehow because these Welsh people left Wales to go to Argentina, somehow that meant that rather than protecting the language, they were running away and that they should have stayed and fought for the language. I mean, come on. You have to be realistic. That's not the way people have worked throughout the centuries. People have moved and left areas for different reasons and to try and protect things. The whole reason why the Massachusetts Bay Colony is established in the Americas, for good or for ill, is because the Puritans were trying to protect their religion against what they saw as persecution from the English. And that is the whole argument for it. Now, again, is it right? Is it wrong? I don't know. You can make arguments on all sides for various reasons, but I think it's a ridiculous comment, and I've seen it brought up even today, and it just boggles my mind sometimes because it's like they didn't realize what was going to happen when they got there, and they didn't understand fully all of what was going to happen to the language in Argentina. So it makes sense that they would have thought in a what they thought was going to be a relatively unsettled landscape, that they would be able to set up a enclave of Welsh, much like they had done in like Pennsylvania and other places. This isn't an uncommon thing. It's happened before. We've seen it happen and talked about it even in the podcast. So it seems ridiculous to say, well, it wouldn't work, or worse yet, that somehow they were running away or fleeing. It just, to me, that irked me actually as I was reading that, especially when I read it in comments that were made in one of the articles I was reading. However, even amongst the settlers, there was division. Some envisioned fertile farmland and easy prosperity, and of course, when faced with harsh conditions, many became disillusioned. Roughly a third of the original settlers eventually returned to Wales or moved to other countries, feeling misled over the overly optimistic promises made by the organizers like the Michael Jones and Lewis Jones. But the enduring controversy that surrounds the impact of the settlement is on the indigenous people of Patagonia. When the Welsh arrived in 1865 to the Chubut Valley, it was home to the Che people, a semi nomadic group with deep knowledge of the land in the area. While initially interactions between the Welsh and the Che were relatively peaceful and in some cases cooperative, the broader colonial context can also not be fully ignored. We have to understand that there's still this sense of, especially these modern times, about the imposition of Europeans in an area which is already settled by other people and what that meant and how that's viewed. And I think it's always good to understand that and to get the context around it. It's not all brightness and hope. There is some darkness that definitely comes into this conversation, and the Welsh population here are not completely oblivious of it. I mean, they may have a better relationship, and they're certainly not in a position in which a standard colony is created. There's no political will that's forcing it. There's no government enhancement. There's no military from the Welsh perspective enforcing their language, their culture, their settlement on the people that already live there. But nonetheless, there's a side effect to all this, which is what we're looking at, which is that the Argentinian government, which invited these Welsh settlers, had its own agenda. The agenda was to populate and secure Patagonia before the Chilean claims could seize the same land. And of course, to what they expressed as civilizing the landscape, which is where a lot of this colonial discussion really lives. And of course, this area was deemed as a frontier not dissimilar to the U.S. West, where people would settle and claim it was, civilizing the area. This policy, of course, will culminate into what becomes known as the conquest of the desert in the late 1870s, and it went on for about a decade on two different occasions, which was a brutal military campaign aiming to bring all of Patagonia under Argentinian control and resulted in the displacement and deaths of thousands of indigenous people, including both the Tehuelche and the Mapuche. This had been defined as a genocide, and it continues to carry a great deal of social discussion in Argentina, and it continues to weigh on the discussion about the Welsh settlement in Patagonia because of that result. I think, in retrospect, if the Welsh had settled there and the later attempts at extinguishing the local indigenous communities had not happened, I think there would have been some argument to be made that it's overblown in the discussion. But when that goes on, even if the Welsh aren't involved, and in some cases it's even talked about that they tried to argue against this, it doesn't change the fact that it happened. And because it happens, more European settlers are brought over to flood into Patagonia, and it eventually helps to create a very different area than what was there before. And it creates the conflict for these indigenous people who, to this day, see this Welsh settlement as the tip of the iceberg of displacing and killing them. And as I said, while the Welsh were not directly involved in the campaign, and they would obviously benefit from the state's efforts to clear the land. As Welsh farms, schools, and chapels flourished, indigenous communities were pushed aside or absorbed under terms not of their own choosing, very similar to what happened in North America. Today, this colonial context is increasingly become recognized, and in Argentina and in Wales, scholars and descendants alike are grappling with the uncomfortable truth that even well-meaning cultural preservation efforts can contribute to the broader patterns of dispossession and erasure. Again, in the 20th century, this tension between these groups resurfaced in the form of government policies in Argentina that restricted the Welsh language education, viewing it as an obstacle to national unity. It took grassroots activism and support from Wales itself to protect and revive Welsh schools and cultural institutions in Patagonia, very similar in some respects to what was happening with the indigenous people, who also were finding their own language and culture under threat to these same arguments. So to head back to the arrival of the Mimosa, the first months on the Patagonian mainland were a test of endurance. The settlers had to move inland and find water, walking and riding ox carts for over 40 miles across the scrubby desert in search of the river, the Chubut River, which was the only real lifeline in this arid landscape. There they established what would become the colony's heart, a settlement known as Rawson, named after Guillermo Rawson, the Argentinian Minister of the Interior who had encouraged the Welsh to settle in this region. But challenges didn't end with finding a water source. As you can imagine, in a semi-arid climate, the soil was poor. Unfamiliar crops failed, flash floods devastated what little they could plant, and many settlers began to question whether they would survive their first winter. Hunger, disease, and isolation took their toll. Letters home that, when they could be sent, spoke of hardship and doubt. Some settlers returned to Wales or moved to other countries, but others stayed. And there was something extraordinary that was happening. As the settlers in the region started to contact the indigenous communities, they began to create a relationship between the two. It was complex, but it wasn't hostile. And because of this, they learned how to track animals, find water, and survive in this different terrain than what they were used to. And the cultural exchange played a critical role in the colony's survival. By the late 1870s, the Welsh had begun building irrigation channels, and this transformed the area into a much better and much more reliable area for growing. Keeping in mind that the late 1870s are when the indigenous people are being cleared, so keep that in context with this whole discussion. Using water from the river, they diverted and distributed to a growing patchwork of farmland so that they could grow wheat, barley, and potatoes, which all began to thrive now. Out of the dust and despair, the Welsh agricultural settlement finally began to take root. More Welsh immigrants arrived over the next few decades, many from mining communities in Pennsylvania and Ohio, bringing new skills and resources and a very American way of building houses. The community expanded with the founding of Trelew in 1886, named after Lewis Jones, and Gaman, which became the central cultural life of the Welsh settlers. In these towns, you could hear Welsh spoken in the markets, see nonconformist chapels in the middle of the pampas, and attend schools where the children were taught in Welsh before Spanish. They also built their first printing press in the region, publishing the I Drafod, a Welsh language newspaper that ran for decades and gave voice to the peoples determined to preserve their identity. Cultural life flourished despite isolation, and the Eisteddfod were held regularly, keeping the bardic traditions alive. And in time, settlers were not just surviving, they were also building lasting and distinctly Welsh society in the land that most, to that point, had never imagined. Now, the one aspect of this which we haven't really discussed is there was an issue of the Welsh identity itself. Over time, many Patagonian Welsh integrated into Argentinian society, as you can imagine, very similar to what happened with the Welsh people in England, in other places such as America, Canada, Australia, New Zealand. This meant that younger generations often grew up learning Spanish first. This then sparked debates within the community. Should they hold tightly to their old language and ways or adapt to the new world around them, which then, of course, would eventually lead to conflicts with the Argentinian government over the language and a pressure by them to promote a Spanish language education and integration, which, of course, meant that a lot of Welsh families in the area did actually become integrated into the cultural context of Argentina, and to an extent at the detriment of their own Welsh heritage. However, even today, nearly 160 years ago, there are still Welsh speakers in Patagonia. They still hold a bilingual education, and the revival of the interest in the 60s and again in recent decades had led to new and renewed ties between Patagonia and Wales. So even though it's complex, even though there are problematic aspects about this discussion, and even though you have this conflict of different scholars talking about the value or the use of this colonization and settlement without the backing of an official government sponsorship and protection, there's still this creation of something bigger. And the one thing I found in looking through this is that there was a group that felt like we should, and I say we, that they felt that Wales should not be encouraging Welsh in Patagonia, that we should not be encouraging the culture because of reasons that I'm not completely fully conversant or in ways that don't make a lot of sense to my mind. Because it's the same as if you said to people in Canada or the United States or whatever, that because of what happened to the indigenous communities, you should not honor the culture of your ancestors. You should not be promoting it in, especially in aspects of linkages between the Welsh government and Patagonia, or trying to put forward language, sending books and teaching materials to Patagonia to help maintain the language. They almost want you to just forget about it, which for people like my grandfather, that would be perfect because that was the last thing they wanted to do was remember the Welsh language and continue to converse in it, or even the culture, really, by comparison to those who came after them. This ideal and concept that somehow out of shame we shouldn't acknowledge this colony exists, I think is problematic. I think it's just as problematic as ignoring and just saying, well, look, it was all great and everything was perfect. And it wasn't until the Argentinian government came that the problems occurred. And we didn't gain any advantage of it when obviously they did. All of this needs to be put into context. And I think that's what's great about history. Put it in context, have people understand, and have them be able to grow from understanding. I think that's what we should be doing. And I think keeping the connection between places like Patagonia and Wales is actually a good thing, because I think it allows a diverse area where small cultural pockets can continue to grow and to develop, and you have more commonalities and less division. And I think that's the thing, that if anything we're learning in this world today, we need less division and more commonalities bridged and more gaps bridged. And to my mind, that's the point of what we're seeing with what the encouraging of the Welsh language would be. But with all that said and done, thank you all for watching and listening today. I hope this has been a good conversation. I hope you've learned something from it. I hope it's not been overly critical or negative to any particular side. I see the value on both sides of the discussion, so I don't immediately throw everything out just because, some parts are more negative than what other people, and maybe even the majority, think is a very positive thing. I think it's good for us to realize that there isn't always positives in every situation. And sometimes people do lose in these. So it's good to know. And with that, thank you all for listening. And if you have any questions, comments, or concerns, complaints, whatever, you can always reach out to me at the Welsh History Podcast at gmail.com. Please do. If you want to get in on other discussions, you can do that at any of my social media, which is usually at Welsh History Pod, or you can reach out to me on Facebook at facebook.com/Welsh History Podcast. Also, if you'd like to contribute to the podcast, you can do so at patreon.com/Welsh History. Thank you once again. Have yourselves a wonderful rest of your day. Ta-ra. Bye-bye. Welsh History Podcast is a member of the Evergreen Podcast Network. To find more information on them, you can do so at evergreenpodcasts.com. Thanks for listening.